In today's video, I've got 30 fast and easy tips for watercolour beginners. So welcome back, and if you're new to my channel, my name is Michelle. On this channel, I teach all things watercolour, including drawing tutorials, a little bit of mixed media, even business and motivation for artists too. If you enjoy this video, please do consider subscribing. That way I can teach more people how to paint and draw. So let's talk about these 30 fast tips. I've had a lot of people join me recently who are complete beginners, and I want to give you a video full of things that are just going to straight away improve your watercolour paintings. So these are things that I use in my own work and that I've taught other people for over 20 years now, not just on the internet, but in real life classes too. These are tips that are going to work for you. They require almost no natural talent. In other words, these are things like organisational tips and things about drawing and materials, about the order in which you apply the paints, and many more useful little tips that perhaps you hadn't thought of. So let's get started with tip number 1. So my first tip is to use more than one water container. You want to use at least 2, because with watercolour painting, as soon as your water gets mucky, it's going to affect the colours that are on your paper, because watercolours are so delicate and so transparent, they're easily affected by dirty water. So I always use 2 jars. I have 1 jar for my initial rinse, and I have 1 jar that I keep for if I need to apply clean water to the paper or just as a second rinsing jar. Some people like to rinse 1 jar with warm colours and 1 jar with cool colours, but for me I keep it a little bit simpler than that. But however you like to arrange your water jars, you want to have more than 1 on the table. Tip number 2 is one that you've probably heard already, and that's always work light to dark. So why do we do this? There are 2 main reasons. One is that watercolours are transparent. You literally can't paint light on top of dark, and so you need to build up gradually. And by putting your lightest colours in first, you don't block out any areas with dark paint that you can't adjust later on. The other reason is that very strong colours tend to run when you paint near them, particularly those with reds in. So it's always safest to leave those till the end. So if you're looking at a painting and just thinking, oh, I don't even know where to start, always light to dark. Tip number 3 is to keep your hands off of the paper. So watercolour paper should be handled by the edges only. If you're erasing pencil, don't do this. Our hands have oil in. Watercolour paint is, as I said, quite delicate, and anything you get on the paper is going to block the paint. That could just be the oil that's naturally in your skin. It could also be things like hand cream and sun cream. Even things like furniture and hairspray can really mess with your paper, so keep your paper clean and try not to put your fingers on it. If you need to lean your whole arm on the paper at any point, just put down a clean piece of fabric or some paper towel. Number 4 is to draw and erase as you go along through your watercolour painting. Now you should get your layout right to start with, of course, but that doesn't mean you have to do all of the drawing at the beginning. It can be quite advantageous to actually draw as you go through the painting. It can stop you getting in a muddle with too many lines, and the less layers of paint that are on top of your pencil, the more easily the pencil will erase at the end. So you might, for example, draw a wall, but put the bricks in later on, maybe after you've got a dry underwash on. That way the pencil's being trapped between less layers. Another thing you can do is erase the pencil lines as soon as you no longer need them. If you have a pencil line that's delineating one area from another and you've painted up to that area and the paint is dry, you don't need that line anymore. You can now see where that area ends. Don't trap the pencil in by adding more paint. Erase that line as soon as you can. Of course, make sure the paint is dry. Number 5 is related to number 4, and that is that paint never improves a bad drawing. Always make sure you're happy with your drawing before you start. Now that might be a small amount of drawing, or it could be a large amount of drawing. It depends how complex your subject is. But even if it's just a few lines, make sure you're happy with them. Watercolour can never be completely adjusted in the way that oils and acrylics can. It's more adjustable than people think, but if your main drawing is completely wrong and things are actually in the wrong place or have got the wrong proportions, trust me, paint is never going to improve it. It's only going to make it look worse. So just make sure you're happy with your drawing before you start to paint. And of course, remove any excess or guidelines so that there's as little pencil on the paper as possible before you start. And talking of starting, for number 6, I want you to put the sky in first. So if you're painting a landscape, it's nearly always appropriate to do the sky first. Stuff like trees sits on top of skies. We want to see the sky through the gaps in the tree. If If you've ever started out painting some trees and then tried to put the sky around them, you'll know how badly that goes. So although you want to follow that light to dark rule, when it comes to landscapes, you nearly always want to put your sky in first. Now, some people will say that watercolor isn't controllable. I'd like to say that that's not true, but tip number 7 is to use a rag or a piece of paper towel to control the water on your brush, because controlling watercolor means controlling water levels. Beginners sometimes understand that there's too much water or too much paint on their paper, so they'll dab at it with paper towel or a rag, but actually a better thing to do is to actually dry the brush. And then with that drier brush, you can use it almost like a little vacuum cleaner to sweep up the water on your paper. For tip number 8, I want you to always store similar colours together. So sometimes people say to me, should I store my colours by manufacturer or actually by the colours that they are? And I always say by the colours. So wherever you're storing your paints or your swatches of paints, so this could be a colour chart that you're making, it could be a palette like this one, or maybe you keep your paints in boxes like this. I want you to store similar colours together. And the reason for this is that you're going to need to compare close together colours, and you're going to need to be able to see them next to each other. If, for example, you've swatched all your Winsor & Newton paints on one page and you've swatched all your Daniel Smith paints on another page, and you've got a beautiful yellow flower to paint, perhaps a daffodil, you need to know which yellow to use. It's not going to be any use to you when those things are on different pages. So store similar colours together and swatch similar colours next to each other. It makes comparison and choosing paints so much easier. Tip number 9 is to swatch your colours and your techniques before you ever put them on your painting. Now, when I teach real life classes, I go around and I sort of chuck lots of little bits of paper like this on the table, and new people are like, well, what's that for? What that's for is for trying things out. So you want to swatch a technique, you want to swatch a colour. With colours, watercolour dries about 50% lighter, so you can allow that colour to dry, and then you can place it next to the area where you're working. There's often impatience with beginners and a feeling of like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, so I'll just chuck things on and hope for the best. But you can actually make this whole process go a little bit smoother for you by trying out techniques. Now, I can teach you a technique on this channel. I can teach you wax resist, or something clever with ink or masking fluid or oil pastels. The truth is, I don't know how that's going to work on the paper that you have. I don't know how quickly it's going to dry in your part of the world. Is it very cold and humid where you live? Is it very hot and dry? Everything you do is going to react slightly differently to the way I teach it. And this is why it's really, really important that you try techniques and colours out with your own paper, with your own paints, and put them on a scrap. Stop chucking things on your paintings and just hoping for the best when you can easily try them out on a scrap of paper. Number 10 is don't allow puddles of paint to form on your paper. So whether you're painting a large area like a sky or a smaller area like a petal, unless you're doing some kind of specific technique where you need uneven water levels, and these do exist, but if you're just painting generally and you're a complete beginner, puddles are dangerous. Where you have puddles, you have uneven drying because that puddle of paint will dry less quickly than the other paint on your paper. This is going to form what they call blooms, or sometimes in the UK we call them cauliflowers, or backruns, drying lines basically, and strange shapes that appear in your paints as they dry. Avoiding leaving puddles, as I spoke about, by using your brush to lift some of that excess paint and water off of the paper, is going to give you a much more even and beautiful result. Tip number 11 is to use the largest brush possible. So the largest brush that you can wield with control for the thing that you're painting, that's the one you want to use. And the reason is that watercolor brushes, they're designed to hold a lot of paint. The paint sits in the body of the brush, flows down to the tip, and allows us to continue painting over a large area. It's necessary with watercolor to apply the paint quickly. And therefore, if you're using a brush that's too small, you're going to be applying the paint slowly. The paint's going to start drying. You're going to get lots of little drying lines, lots of little brush marks when you wanted a smooth effect. There's no right or wrong size of brush to choose. But when it comes to very, very tiny brushes like this one, I almost never use them. The smallest I go to is usually a brush like this. Even a brush that size with a fine point will give you really, really fine details. Unless you're painting something like hedgehog's eyelashes, you never need one of those tiny brushes. So use the largest brush for the application that you can manage. So for tip number 12, I want you to use at a minimum students' quality materials. So you get 3 types of materials, basically 3 levels of quality. You get artist quality, these are the best of the best, they're fantastic. And then you get students' quality, these are made by large brands. They have much experience in making materials. They're just being a little bit more economical with those materials in their students' range, but they're still very good and perfectly usable for beginners. And then you get unbranded, drugstore or stationer's paints, and these can be absolutely awful. Some of the paper is terrible and falls apart. The brushes can be appalling. And so whilst as a beginner, maybe you're on a budget and you know you're going to make a lot of mistakes, maybe as a beginner you don't want to buy top of the range, but you should at least be using students' quality. Have a look at some of the well-known brands. Most of them carry a student's range. It's far more reliable than something you just pick up from a random store that's also selling onions and coat hangers. So if you can hear some noise and you've noticed I've got a few raindrops in me, I had to just run out and get my laundry in because it was getting darker and darker and I could see it's starting to rain, so I had to run. So I'm a little bit damp now. Such are the delights of the British summertime. So let's get on with our next tip, and that is do not stand your brush in the water jar. So watercolour brushes have got a really delicate tip on. You don't ever want to be doing that, not even for a moment, not even for half a minute. Put them on the table always. Lay down some newspaper if you're worried about mess. When I was teaching real life art classes, I was forever telling students to take their brushes out of the water jars. I got my regular students into such a sort of paranoia about this that sometimes I'd be coming back into the room, I'd have popped out for something, and I'd hear them say to sort of new people, she's coming in, just take your paintbrush out of the water, just take the paintbrush out of the water jar. And they'd be really, really worried because I had drummed it into them that you don't stand your paintbrush in the water jar. Now, especially if you're coming from something like oil painting or acrylics, the sort of brushes that they use for acrylics and for oils have much stiffer bristles. And to a certain extent, you have to stand your paintbrushes in the water jars, at least for short amounts of time when you're acrylic painting, because acrylic paint dries to plastic if you don't keep the brush wet. You've got no such excuses with watercolour painting. You'll end up with brushes that are bent and the tips of the hairs will do this kind of fish hook thing. And then you'll be there with a pair of nail scissors like I used to be in the past, trying to trim the point back in. Let me save you the time, it doesn't work. So get out of the habit of standing your brushes in the water. Tip number 14 is to give your working area and your paint palette, all of those things, a really good clean up after you finish each painting. Now, I'm a real neat freak, but even I get into an extreme mess when I'm painting. It's just like anything you're working on. If you were going to try a new recipe, would you want to go into the kitchen and still be dealing with all the dishes from the night before? You'd probably want to clean up first. We all like that feeling, don't we, of starting from a clean slate? And it really is lovely to start a new painting with everything clean and fresh. You certainly don't want old mixes of paint in your palettes. It's not even like you're carrying on with the same painting and you might need those colours again. So get into the habit of having a good clean up and washing your palette at the end of each painting. If you're using block paints or you've got paints that have been squeezed out and dried like these, you can still clean the palette up. You don't have to soak it. You don't have to remove all of that paint. It's probably still perfectly good. A toothbrush or a scrubbing brush will just remove that top layer and clean up the wells so that everything is fresh and new for your next painting. Now, I know there are some tutors that won't agree with me, but as far as I'm concerned, dirty, mucky palettes are going to do nothing except muddy up your colours. So have a good clean up before you start your next painting. Tip number 15 is to practice a flat wash. Now, I've actually got a beginner's watercolour course and the flat wash is the first module in it. Now, it's not very often when you're doing a painting that you actually have to make a flat wash. However, being able to do a flat wash is, in my opinion, really vital because it gives you control over the paint. If you can do a flat wash, and they're really quite difficult, if you can do a flat wash, you can pretty much do anything. You can control the paint and you can work up your other techniques from there. I have a whole video about how to do flat washes. I'll link to it in the description of this one. In my opinion, it's the first technique you should be practicing. Tip number 16 is don't use loose paper. You want to either stretch your paper, and I have a video that I'll link to in the description of this video that will tell you how to do it, or you can use a watercolor block. That's a pad of paper that's gummed around the edges, and this is going to reduce what they call cockling, which is where your paper goes bumpy and your paint sits in puddles. We've already discussed how that's not a good thing. Have a look at this board here. This has got some samples on from when I was building my most recent course, my landscape painting course. And obviously it's had some paint and water on, but look how flat the paper is. When you work on stretched paper, you will still get a little bit of bumping whilst you're working, but every time the paper dries, it will dry as flat as a board. Paper stretching is quick and easy. It will save you money because you don't have to buy paper that's quite as thick. You can also buy loose sheets, which in most parts of the world are cheaper. So give yourself the best surface to work on. Spend a few minutes learning how to stretch your paper. You'll never look back. Number 17, I have some general painting advice. This is something that professional artists do without thinking, but I noticed that a lot of beginners don't do. And perhaps it's because you're used to attending classes and you're in this massive rush to, get something worth looking at within an hour and a half, but they don't let the paper dry. Now, when I'm doing a painting, there's often a time, particularly with something like a landscape, where I just let the whole thing dry. Of course, it's wonderful to work on the wet surfaces and to let things bleed one into the other. But there's always going to come a point where you're just going to end up losing control. And you're going to end up getting bleed lines and backgrounds where you don't actually want them. Now, if you're doing a botanical painting, say on white paper, you're painting lots of individual petals, it's certainly possible that you could just keep moving around the board. You never actually have to stop because while you're working on one petal, a petal on another flower that's sort of 6 inches away is drying. And you can keep everything under control. But if you're painting a bigger subject, a garden, a landscape, maybe even an animal, there will come a point where you need to let things dry. And I don't mean for 5 minutes either. If your whole paper is saturated and you're starting to feel like you're just losing control over the process, put it aside and let it dry. You're going to find it so much easier when you come back to put another layer on. Tip number 18 is to use an old brush for mixing. Now, I've got a cheap acrylics brush here. I don't paint in acrylics very often. Brushes like this, they have really stiff bristles and they're fantastic for mixing, particularly if you've got pan paints or if you've got paints like the ones I showed you earlier where they've dried in the pan. Don't be scrubbing at them with your best watercolor brushes. You can either use old acrylic brushes like this or just brushes that were your best brushes and are now your older brushes because you've got newer brushes. Wherever you need to really mix vigorously and scrape at pans of paint, you want to use an old brush. In this way, your best brushes will last longer. My next tip, tip number 19, is to paint things in the direction that they grow. So if you're painting something that has an obvious growth pattern, I'm thinking about hair, fur, grasses, reeds and trees. You want to paint from the base, the root, up and out. Whether you're using a pencil or a brush, the point will naturally taper as you lift it off of the paper. And you can get a very unnatural look if you paint things in the wrong direction. So say you've got some tall grasses, you paint them from the top going down to the base, they're going to look very lumpy and stubby because they're just going to start in a hard line and come down looking rather lumpy. If you paint upwards and outwards, you'll get a natural tapering. Anything that grows is going to look a lot more natural. It's also just going to be easier to paint that way. For tip number 20, I want you to stay away from black and white paint if you're a beginner in watercolors. Now, I'm not someone that ever bans colors or says that you should never use certain colors, but there are colors that will get you into difficulty as a beginner. You especially shouldn't be mixing black in to darken any colors. There's very little black in nature. And because black is a surface that doesn't reflect any light, it can have a deadening effect on your paintings. White is opaque, so it will muddy up and give an opacity to your watercolors. I also don't like this idea of dabbing out white highlights at the end. This is because opaque paint doesn't reflect light in the same way as transparent paint. It's going to look like you've used typewriter correction fluid. Now, are there occasions where you can use black paint and white paint in watercolor painting? Absolutely, I often use white paint and there are some clever tricks I have for using it in a way that's subtle. But using either of these colours as a beginner when you don't really understand the process of watercolour painting is going to give you muddy, opaque, dead looking colours, is going to muck up your palette, leave everything a little bit murky and dirty looking. So it's a really good idea just to not use those colours when you first start out until you get used to mixing with other colours. What do you use instead? For your white, you're just going to use the white of the paper. To lighten colours, you're just going to add more water. And if you need something really, really dark and you don't want to use black, you can try a colour called Payne's Grey. For tip number 21, I want you to practice mixing your colours on the paper. So what do I mean by this? Now, if you had some green areas to paint in a landscape, for example, you could take some blue paint and some yellow paint and mix up a green and apply it to that area. But it'd look rather flat. And if you had any sort of brush strokes or drawing lines, it's going to look very noticeable and uncomfortable. Be a bit braver. Try chucking those colours individually on. Just put the yellow on the paper and then put the blue on the paper and then blend them a little bit, but not too much. You can practice this technique before you try it on your paintings. You're going to get areas with much more beauty and much more interest. Watercolours blending together on the paper. It's absolute magic. It's a technique that can't really be replicated in any other medium. So take advantage of your beautiful paints, let them do their own thing. Don't always overblend them before you apply, particularly where you're not looking for a flat area of colour. So if you're painting something like a meadow, the last thing you want is for it to all be flat green. Allow your paints to mix on the paper. Number 22, I have another drawing tip, and this is don't press too hard when you're drawing on your watercolour paper. Watercolour paper is quite thick and spongy and it can be dented quite easily. And if you dent your paper, and there are reasons you can do this on purpose, but if you dent your paper, what will happen is the pigment will be attracted to that little dip and it will sit into it. So the difficulty you have is that if you press really hard with your drawing, even if you erase the pencil later, or maybe you erased it earlier on because it was a mistake, you might find it comes back to haunt you because the paint is going to be attracted and sit in those little dips. I have other videos that will tell you about whether or not you should use a hard pencil or a soft pencil, but regardless of the pencil you're using, try not to press too hard so that the pigments in the watercolours are not attracted to those dents. For tip number 23, it's a really cheap brush that you can add to your set, and it's an old toothbrush. I always use an old toothbrush like this. It's so versatile. There's so many things that it can be used for. You can splatter with it, you can paint with it. And the older and scruffier and more bashed up the bristles get, the more natural the effects you can make with it. I use it for things like painting trees. It'll also clean your palette and scrape off any mucky paint from the corners of those little square wells. It's a fantastic, versatile tool, and it will cost you next to nothing. So tip number 24 is don't buy huge sets of things. They're almost always a waste of money. Now, for full disclosure, I have my own branded sets. I have a brush set that has 3 brushes in. I also have some watercolour sets. Now, if you're going to buy a set of paints or a set of brushes, you want to make sure that you're going to use them all. There's so much environmental destruction happening at the moment because people are just buying things that they don't use. It's a huge bugbear of mine. I was in a Facebook group the other day for watercolorists and somebody said, oh, I got this set of 20 brushes. They were only $3. And I just thought to myself, okay, you only paid $3 for those. And even if they're pretty cheap, they should cost a lot more than that. If you're not paying, someone else is paying. That could be animals, it could be the environment, or it could be the workers that are being exploited to make these things. And the truth is that huge sets are almost never worth the money. You don't need a set of 8 tree brushes, you probably only need 1. Before you buy from any manufacturer, you should consider just buying one of those products. For instance, if you really like glittery, sparkly paints, and somebody's got a set of 8 that they're offering, and you know that you'd like to use 8 different glittery, sparkly colours, that's fine. But have a look and see if you can buy those colours individually and just buy 1 tube. It may be that when you get that 1 tube, you find you didn't like that particular manufacturer's stuff after all, and you haven't wasted money on a huge set. A lot of these very cheap sets, and I'm thinking of these massive sets of, 200 watercolour pencils, and you're getting this for $30, when really 1 good watercolour pencil can cost you $3. What you're actually paying for is the packaging. It's always the pigment that's the most expensive thing. Packaging is much less expensive, which means that manufacturers of cheap art materials can put all of their money into giving expensive looking, beautiful looking boxes and cases, pretty colours and leaflets, but what they're not giving you is good quality pigments. There can be all sorts of things wrong with cheap brushes. Somebody on one of the Facebook groups the other week wrote, these brushes I bought, they're a bit strange, it looks like they're made from some mangy old cat. And I thought to myself, okay, it's not unheard of. This is a quick tips video, so I'm not going to go into the ethics of brushes on this video. But for the sake of your wallet and for the sake of the environment, please stop buying these massive sets of cheap rubbish. Think about what you need. Look at a set carefully. The best watercolour sets are the most basic ones, things like split primary sets, where you might have 6 or 10 colours. Look at your brush sets and make sure you're going to use every one of those brushes. Almost all decent manufacturers sell things in singles. It's far better to spend a little bit more for one good brush or 5 good watercolour pencils than it is to buy these massive cheap sets. You're just going to find them disappointing when you use them. You'll have wasted your money and they just trash the environment. I honestly could talk about this subject for another 3 hours, but I'll stop right there. For tip number 25, I want you to use a limited palette within each painting. So what do I mean by that? A limited palette is the idea of just using a few colours. Now this doesn't mean that you might only own a few colours. It just means that you're going to stick to just using a few colours within one painting. What this does is it gives the painting an atmosphere. It makes everything hang together. It's especially easy if you've got pan paints, for example, in a set to keep dipping in and out every single colour and just end up with something that doesn't look very cohesive. Try my 4 colour method. What you do is you pick one of each primary. So one blue, one yellow, one red or pink. You add in a strong staining colour because you're always going to need some darks. That might be a blue or a neutral. And then as you go through the painting, just add more colours in when you need them. So start with this small amount of colours, write them down and think, can I mix this next colour from these colours I'm already using? If not, it's fine to add a few more in. There's no right size for a limited palette. If you're doing something simple like a sunset landscape, you might only need 3 colours. If you're painting a garden, you might need 15 colours. But whatever the case, you want to try to stick to a limited palette within one painting. It's going to help your paintings to have beauty and atmosphere and cohesion. For tip number 26, I want you to be careful of masking fluid. Now, if you haven't come across masking fluid yet, it's a type of sort of liquid rubber. You apply it to your paper and it blocks out that area of paper. In other words, you can chuck a load of paint on. Later on, you remove the masking fluid and it's kept that area white. Sounds fantastic, but actually it can be rather tricky to use. Now, it's a very good tool. I do use masking fluid myself, but it's never been designed to block out large areas of your paper. And if you try to do that with it, it is likely to tear your paper. I'll link to a video in the description of this one that's going to give you some common masking fluid mistakes. But in the meantime, just be a little bit careful with masking fluid. If I had money for every beginner that I've ever seen tear their paper with badly applied and wrongly used masking fluid, I'd be extremely rich. And the worst thing is that it puts those people off and they're sort of like, oh, I'm not using masking fluid, terrible stuff. And the truth is, it's a really useful tool. You just have to use it with a bit of respect. Tip number 27 is get yourself a few watercolour pencils. Even if you're not interested in them as a medium in their own right, they're a fantastic addition to watercolour paintings. I particularly like them to add lines to things. You can add texture to tree bark. You can add grasses to landscapes. You can add lines and details to flowers. You certainly don't need very many. Something like a dark grey, a dark brown, a green and maybe a burgundy. Buy individual ones. I've lots of videos on my channel about how to use them. And for fine details, they're so much faster and easier than using a tiny paintbrush. Tip number 28 is don't always rescue your paintings by drawing ink outlines around everything. You know who you are. Now, some people get into this habit of whenever they get towards the end of a watercolour painting, they're always drawing ink lines around everything. They just feel like something's missing and they'll say, well, it looks much better this way. Now, this is a red flag. There's nothing wrong with using ink and watercolour together as a medium, preferably a decision that you make at the beginning of the painting. But if you get towards the end of a painting and you're always finding you're needing that ink just to clarify things, what it is it's a sign that you don't have enough tonal contrast in your watercolour paints. And this means that although you might have lots of different colours on the paper and lots of different shapes, nothing looks like it's showing up properly. This is because you're lacking tonal contrast, and at this stage you need to start clarifying things and making more difference between the light areas and the dark areas, probably by going in with a bit more dark paint. So set yourself a bit of a challenge. Say to yourself, I'm going to get to the end of this painting and I'm not going to use any ink on it. Pen and wash is a fantastic medium. Try using it the other way round, putting the pen on first and then adding some watercolour washes on top. But do avoid always rescuing your paintings with the ink, because if you do this, you're not allowing yourself to learn fully about tonal contrast. A watercolour painting should be able to work on its own merits, and using ink should be a decision that you make to work in that medium, not something that's there to rescue your watercolours. For number 29, my tip is to finish your paintings. So many people abandon a painting halfway through. There's something that professional artists call the ugly stage. It's not when you get up first thing in the morning, you haven't put your makeup on and the postman's at the door. It's a stage that paintings go through. It's usually in the middle, so we have all of this white paper and all of this potential at the beginning. And then halfway through, everything starts to look a bit muddy and a bit murky. Nothing is how we've planned it, and we are inclined to abandon the project. But there is an ugly stage, and it's particularly noticeable with watercolours because we put the darks in at the end, which means that in the middle there isn't any tonal contrast, so everything's going to look a bit rubbish. Some of my best paintings looked absolutely appalling halfway through. Now, if you're a beginner, I can't guarantee you'll get to the end of the painting with a good result, but it's really important nevertheless to go through that stage because every painting that you do is a learning process. If you get to the end and it still looks awful, that's okay because you've learned something. But it's really important to go through the full process of painting from beginning to end each time. It's only a piece of paper. What you've learned will help you with the next one. Tip number 30 is to learn to draw. Drawing is not a separate medium to painting. It's part of painting. In fact, drawing is the basis of all other skills. I would say it helps with everything, even crafts like pottery. Drawing teaches us manual dexterity and mark making. You're going to need this when you're painting too. Now, I don't want to discourage you if drawing is not your strong point. I don't want to say to you, oh, well, you have to go and learn to draw for 2 years before you can ever pick up a paintbrush. That's rubbish. Pick up the paintbrush now and have a go at painting. I'm just encouraging you that as you go through this journey of learning to paint, you continue improving your drawing skills. Not only do I have a full comprehensive drawing course, if you really struggle with this, I also have a playlist on this channel with lots of drawing tips. So do let me know in the comments which one of these 30 watercolor tips you found the most useful. And you can watch my most popular drawing tips video right now.